Yeah, Ian.
Okay, so we are now recording. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody. This is the kickoff meeting for Shoreline and for our upcoming work cycle, our 2-month work cycle for Surfliner. So once again, if you could go into the meeting document, I have the link in the chat. Hopefully you all have access to it. And if you could put your name on the attendees list, that would help us out. Appreciate it. So the agenda, I'm going to go over the team members and then talk about the overviews, an overview of the steps that we've gone through so far, and then where we're going from here, the big picture, and talk about some technical roadblocks and where we're going next technically, and then I'll give some practical information. All right, so starting off with the team. So I'm the product owner, Tom Brittnacher. The tech lead for what I'm calling phase 1, which is our fall 2019 work, was Tom Johnson. The tech lead for phase 2, which is our upcoming work cycle, is Alex Dunn. Our proposed developers, which we identified at the most recent product owner and tech lead meeting, are Tom Johnson, Matt Critchlow, Vivian Chu, and Ian Lessing. So I'm not sure if all those folks, I don't know what the status is in terms of who's working on what and for how much, but those are folks that have been identified. And also with DevOps, Michael Stewart, Thor Brickman, and the new UCSB Cloud Solutions Architect, which I don't think is here yet. And then our subject matter expert, Amy Work from San Diego. All right, so overview of steps up until now. So, so Tom, did you want to start with an overview of our technical steps up to now?
Yeah, sure thing. I'm going to go ahead also and apologize for any background noise. I hope that it won't be an issue, but I'm in a hotel in San Francisco, and the Wi-Fi in the room is very poor, but the conference Wi-Fi that I have access to down in the lobby is lovely. So here I am. If there's background noise, sorry about that. I'll start by taking us way back to, I suppose, the winter of 2018. I'm just seeing John's comments pop up.
If I could just speak.
That was not directed at me.
Yeah, yeah, no.
Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah.
So in the winter of 2018, there was a contract with DCE to push some of this work forward, and that was largely focused around getting a platform up with geo blacklight to expose this content, and also to provide a ingest process. And the platform that they chose for the ingest process was a Hyrax 1.0 based thing called GeoWorks. Our work, fast forward several years, and while that project wrapped and DCE handed off the work that they had done, none of that ever got deployed at UC Santa Barbara. So fast forward to late this summer, I suppose, and we have two pieces of software. One is a geo blacklight, very slightly customized geo blacklight application, and the other is a fairly heavily customized, but mostly in the back end GeoWorks application. The goal of the work that we did this fall was explicitly to do two things: to get the Geo Blacklight Discovery side deployed. I believe it is recording, Amy. The Geo Blacklight Discovery side we wanted to get deployed, and the other thing that we wanted to do was make the actual ingest process work. So we spent some sort of offhand cycles initially, and then some actual kind of split sprint time where I was the only developer working on those things. On one of those fronts, we have a pretty strong success, and on the other, we do not. So where things stand now is that we have a setup for the Geo Blacklight application and its various system level dependencies. So that's Geo Server and Solar and Postgres, and those things are set up within so within the Surfliner project. We have those set up to deploy in the way that's standard for Surfliner. So if you care about the details of things like this, then what we have is a code base for the Geo Blacklight application, a Helm chart that deploys the sort of Surfliner standard solar system with Solar Cloud, and then the Geo server, as well as a sort of out of the box Postgres installation. So the Geo server Helm chart is separate and maintained by us. The Solar chart is maintained as part of the Starlight project. So it's shared between those two projects, and then the Postgres stuff is just all out of the box. And we're deploying that successfully last fall to our Kubernetes cluster at UCSB. I think one of the very first steps of development on the upcoming work cycle will be to reproduce that at both campuses and make any tweaks that we need to that deployment process. Speaking to the content ingest process, we have a process for ingesting data via JSON, and that works well if that content is already in a Geo server and we can already format it to JSON. So the big gap there is figuring out what our content lifecycle and process for putting content into Geo server, as well as putting it into Geo Blacklight will be. So that part largely fell down because when we started, we assumed that we would use the GeoWorks application. Deploying the GeoWorks application was a non-starter for a couple of reasons. And when we ended up digging in deeper, what we found was that GeoWorks is just completely unmaintained and has no community around it. So what maybe looked slightly ascendant back in 2018 was eventually abandoned by its main participants. And we went through the process of having it formally deprecated within the Samvera community to kind of protect anybody else from going through what we went through with it. But the outcome is that I ended up spending some cycles on writing up a custom ingest process that didn't get terribly far just due to time constraints. So we're left in a position where one of the first things also that we have to do in this work cycle is make sure that we can get local content from both UCSB and UCSD into these systems. And I think a big part of what we need to accomplish to make this project successful is making that process really work for us. So I think that's the rundown. If I forgot anything, either Tom or Alex, I'd invite you both to jump in and fill in any gaps.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Yeah. All right, so I am going to attempt to share my screen here and show you what we've got so far. And okay, so can you see my can you see my browser here? Okay, great.
Yes.
All right, so this is what we have at the moment. As you can see, it's not branded or anything. It's just the standard Geo Blacklight. So you have your, when I move my cursor, can you see my cursor? Cool, okay. So we have the standard search text box. You've got your map interface. You can zoom to a location and search that way. Or you have these pre-canned searches based on either institution, place name, subject, or data type. So first I'm just going to click on this search, a blank search box, just to show you everything that's in here right now. We only have 9 items in here. But this is a typical first phase of a results screen that you would get. So you still have your map, and you can control what these results are based on what you're seeing in the window here. So it adjusts your results based on what you're seeing in the window. So you can see that a bunch of 4 of them went away because I'm in beyond their areas. I'm just going to back out again so you can see all 9. So, and then as you put your cursor over it, you can see the bounding box on the map. Next to that, you have an icon that tells you what type of material it is, whether it's a point shapefile, a polygon shapefile, a scan map, a raster, or a line. And actually, you can see here the data type. The next is the institution icon. So as you can see, we don't have any UCSB or UCSD content in here right now. So this is just metadata from other institutions. You can see those. And then at the far right are the access limitations, whether they're public or restricted. So if I click on the Stanford, you get your results metadata. You get a bounding box in this case because we don't have access to this. And there is a button here to log in and view and download. So that's logging into Stanford. So anybody at our campuses wouldn't be able to log in for this. So that's one question we'll have to get to eventually, is whether or not we want these kinds of records in here. Whether we want to show people that this data exists even though they don't have access to it, or if we want to suppress those. So then if I go back and let me pick. So if you do have access to it and it's a vector file, like in this case it's a polygon vector file, you actually can see the file on top of a map interface and you can interact with it. So if I click on one of these polygons, I get the attributes down below. So I can do some previewing of it before I download it. And then in this case, there are different formats that you can export it in. and there's metadata available, or you can open it in Cardo. Not all of these buttons are working at the moment, but the buttons are there. So I think that's about all I wanted to say about that. And so this is just a prototype at this point.
And how did you get the data in there? Is this the case where you had to copy it onto the app server and do a rake thing to get the data in?
Well, there is no data in it. These are just metadata files. Correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, but the data actually still sits at those institutions. So like this Stanford data is sitting at Stanford. So if I want to export it, it's actually going to Stanford's, GeoBlacklight stack to get it. So when we eventually ingest our own data, that will go in our local stack and be shared through these links. And then hopefully we can also share our metadata with other institutions so that our record at Stanford, they click on it and they get it from our servers.
So yeah, so that's pretty close to accurate. The big word switch that happens to make that true is if you switch GeoBlacklight for GeoServer. So this data, this metadata that you see here is indexed in our Solar and exposed via our GeoBlacklight, and Stanford's GeoBlacklight is not in the loop at all. But the content that we're pointing to here is in a GeoServer instance over at Stanford, and there are some other pieces of content here that we have indexed from MIT and a couple of other places. And this is really just a simple demo data set. Ron, I think, was that Ron?
Yep, it was.
Okay, yeah, so I think this is the same ingest process that that we used, or that Alex linked you to yesterday. And the way that I got the content in is I pulled that, I shelled into the pod that's running the GeoBlacklight server and ran that process locally. So I curled this, or wgetted the JSON down,
right,
and raked it in, or whatever that process says to do is what I did.
Was it just the JSON, or there are a bunch of directories in there? BB, BD, blah, 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 blah. Did you have to pull all of those in and before you did the rake thing? Or did all of those have to be on the app server?
Maybe we're talking about different processes. Let me make sure that you have the link to the easy thing that I did.
Yeah, that's what I like.
I promise it was easy.
Yeah, that's what I want like a hello world so I can test our installation. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have another question. So there seem to be three pieces to this, like an app server, a Postgres, and a Solar. Where does the Postgres fit in this? Does the data go into the Postgres first and then this gets indexed into the Solar, or
no? I think the Postgres mainly is user data and maybe a couple other things.
Okay, all right, thanks.
But yeah, it's a Rails app, so there's a couple of
it needs
a couple of things in the migrations that you can, if you browse in Surfliner to Shoreline Discovery, you can find the migrations and see exactly what's in the Postgres database.
Okay.
But there should be no overlap with the indexed Solar data.
Okay, all right, thanks.
So then, oops, sorry.
Speaking from the mountaintop there.
They're kind of multiple screens. I gotta mute myself. Mute yourself on your laptop. Go to Zoom and mute yourself. Okay, I'm muted, right? Yeah.
Yes.
They can hear you. Right. Sorry about that. We're all sort of looking independently on our laptops. John Jablonski. So what you just said about the Postgres database, Tom Johnson, where does the so all this data is all these 9 the data behind these 9 records is all residing at their local institutions. Once there is a path to put our own local data in, where does our local data reside? Is that inside the Postgres database, or is it a file structure living somewhere in a larger repository architecture?
Yeah, that's a good question. The local geodata lives in GeoServer. So the largest portion of the technical work that is done is that we can deploy that successfully, and it's standing there ready for us to point content to. So that's a big win. And yeah, that's roughly the answer to your question, is that the actual interesting content here, other than just the descriptive content, is hosted by GeoServer. And I guess one of the interesting remaining questions is, what is our strategy for handling access control to that content? I understand that some people who are doing restricted content and public content have a public GeoServer and a restricted GeoServer, and that's the main way that they manage that separation. And that may be a strategy that we adopt as well, but there's probably some fussing to do with making sure that we have the right kinds of protections in place around GeoServer as well as permissioning.
So does each
sorry,
site...
is that a helpful answer, John, before we move on?
I guess I always assumed that GeoServer, or it was always my impression, that GeoServer and equally ArcGIS Server were really a pass-through, and they would be pointing to a data store somewhere, whether that was in a database, whether that was in a geodatabase, whether that was in a file hierarchy of shaped files, or it could be in a federation of spatial databases. I didn't know that GeoWorks stores the content itself.
Yeah, I think that's true. That GeoServer hosts that content directly. That may not be where we want it for preservation or for long-term storage, but definitely for GeoBlacklight's access purposes, that's the content lives directly in a drive that sits in GeoServer.
And Ron, did you have another question?
Oh, and I was just trying to understand, is there a GeoServer, or does each site need a GeoServer, or, yeah, so it sounds like there is a GeoServer somewhere that at least initially we'll all be using.
There'd be one deployed for each GeoBlacklight instance. So along with the Shoreline Discovery app, we have a Helm chart to deploy the GeoServer, and should be able to bring it up as a service to each individual deployment if we want. And I think that's the strategy that we have in mind, is that UCSD will host a GeoServer and UCSB will host a GeoServer, and at least for the production content, that's what we're looking at.
All right, good. That's what I needed to know. Thanks.
Yeah, and then my understanding is how we would share data is that we would ingest the metadata from UC San Diego data into ours, into Solar, and then our metadata can be ingested into San Diego, so we can both have access to the same file.
Yeah, and one of the things that may have, I'm not sure, this may be projecting a little bit, but John, one of the things that may have led you astray is that there was in the DCE process a Hyrax and therefore a Fedora. And part of the process was to load the content into Hyrax, manage the metadata there, and then import that to part of what happened in that process is it got mirrored into GeoServer, and then it would get pushed into GeoBlacklight as part of a GeoBlacklight ingest process. But the purpose of the Hyrax in that case was to be an on-road to the GeoServer and GeoBlacklight edifice. And there wasn't ever really an intent to use that GeoWorks in a real curatorial way. Rather, it was a pile of infrastructure that could be used for ingest. And sort of part of our evaluative process was, first of all, realizing that that was a very heavyweight way of handling the thing, and then also realizing that it was completely impractical to try and actually deploy it given how out of date things are. So we're kind of left in a position where the problem that was trying to be solved by having that Hyrax in place is now one that we get to solve anew, and hopefully in a lighter weight way. But yeah, that in the previous DCE developed workflow, there wasn't really an idea that the Fedora and Solr that sat next to Hyrax would be anything other than a foil for creating the ingest process. Does that make sense? I'm not hearing any concerns about that. So
yeah, it makes general sense.
For a question for Tom B, you just mentioned, I think, swapping metadata with UCSD bidirectionally. So I take it that GeoBlacklight is not doing any kind of federated search or automated pulling of metadata to present this kind of federated search?
Well, the federated search, rather than being like a typical federated search where you're searching, multiple databases, it's like we would have to acquire that metadata and ingest it into our system, the way I understand it. And so that's the Open Geo Metadata project is, it's a GitHub place where people can put their metadata and other institutions can then take it and ingest it into their GeoBlacklight instances.
So is that a requirement of this, that we offer discovery for other institutions' data?
No, it's not a requirement. It's just something we want to do.
Okay.
So we're interested in, because that's one way that we can provide access to data to our users, rather than us having to get that data and describe it and store it and all of that. We can just point to where it exists elsewhere. But that is something that we have to internally decide that we're going to ingest these. But the thing about OpenGeo metadata is that if you go to, say, Stanford's GitHub space for that, they're just a bunch of files with numbers. So you're not really going to go through and curate, this one and this one, but not that one. It's almost an all or nothing type of thing. Now, that being said, I think we can separate out public versus private, or at least hopefully there is a way to do that. Like if we decide that we're not going to ingest the metadata for Stanford's private data, we can segregate that out somehow. I don't know what that process looks like, but
yeah, it sounds like the kind of thing you'd want to do because, people from here aren't going to have access to private data held elsewhere, right?
Yeah, we'll have to have a debate about it because there are different opinions. At Stanford, they like to include those because then their users know that it exists and they know to ask for it.
Oh.
But Stanford has money to buy the things if somebody asks. So we'll have to talk about that.
Yeah, and sometimes, Greg, that use case is just to expose that metadata is to let someone know that the data exists in the first place. even if it does wind up being in a at an institution where the external partners can't access it. I guess my next question, if I can jump in, what is the path to putting UCSB data into this instance and serving it out?
I think we can answer that with the whole rest of the presentation, because a lot of that is we need to figure that out. Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and move on, and then we can maybe ask some more questions at the end if folks have more questions about the actual GeoBlacklight. Because I want to go over all the requirements gathering that we've been doing over the last 4 or 5 months, and just kind of walk you through the process. So the first thing we did, and this was primarily Amy and myself, we started out with a literature review, and we wanted to go through all sorts of journal articles and documents to see what people are looking for in a geospatial discovery tool. We also looked at Stanford's, there's one specific article that talks about Stanford's personas and user stories. So it's the document that really details what they did as part of this process before they built theirs. And then we here at UCSB wrote a document before the DCE work, kind of guiding their steps. And if you can you see the Zotero on my screen? Okay, good. So you're seeing everything on that screen. Okay, good. So we found 47 different articles, and we went through them, and we pulled up, we categorized them and pulled out any sort of feature that they were saying that was something that the users would want. And so we created a list of 117 features. So this column F, these are all the features that we got through this literature review. And so that was like step one, just to kind of get all these features down. And then what we did, and placing no value on them at this point, it's basically just a list. The next thing we did was we reviewed other GeoBlacklight instances. So we looked at New York University, Stanford, the Big Ten, Cornell, Berkeley, Princeton, and Columbia. And for each one of these, we went through that feature list and we indicated 0 if they don't have that feature, 1 if they do have it, and 2 if they have it, but they do it really well. And so we captured that for each of those institutions, and gathered some notes as well. So this was kind of like our first run through of this feature list. And through that process, we also found that there were a lot of features that these GeoBlacklight instances had that we thought were really cool. And so we added them to our list as well. So at the end of that project, we had 134 features to work with. And we have a document. This is, I'm not sure, you probably don't, if you're not part of the Surfliner project, you probably don't have access to these documents, but we'll have to figure out a way to make these publicly available. But anyway, so we have also in a written form our evaluation of those in terms of, found on all instances versus found on some instances versus not found on any instances. So then we were able to do, at this time, then Tom was able to get our GeoBlacklight up and running. And so we did the exact same thing to ours. And so Amy took a pass at it, and I took a pass at it, going through all these features and doing the same thing. Identify, if it has it, if it doesn't have it, or if it has it and does it well. And then we met and we conferred and went through that list. And as part of that, we gave it we identified it as either it has the feature, but it still needs work. It has the feature, but X number of instances do it better. It doesn't have it and others do, or no one has it of the ones that we reviewed. And we have a document that spells that out as well, pretty much the same format, but specifically for Shoreline. So then we also talked to some additional stakeholders. We talked to a GIS manager in a professor's lab. So for those of you who know Thomas, who works in Annabelle Ford's GIS lab, and also some PhD students who are researching geospatial discovery. And also at UC San Diego, Amy talked to a campus facilities manager. I'm not sure if I have that title exactly right. But we wanted to get some other perspectives of what they're looking for, or what types of things that they would find important in one of these. Unfortunately, at this point, we were rushed for time, and so that documentation didn't yet get into the Google Drive, but we have documentation on those meetings.
Tom, I think there was a question in the chat about an example of something that was in our requirements or part of the gap analysis requirements that we found that nobody was doing successfully.
Oh, okay. Yeah, go ahead.
And I just plopped something in that I think that no one can draw a box or a point on the map in the search area to actually identify. So it's either search by name or zoom in, but you can't actually interact with the map to draw a region of interest.
Yeah, thanks. The way my screen is right now, I can't see the chat at all because I'm sharing my screen. So thanks for that. And yeah, please let me know if anything else comes up in chat. Yeah, and I'll get into a few more specifics also. So at this point, what we are ultimately trying to do from this gap analysis was to determine, where we are with what we're looking at here in our original GeoBlacklight, and where we need to be for a minimum viable product. What is the minimum that this thing needs to do in order for it to be publicly available and have people get access to it. And so this is the first time that we've actually looked at features and put any sort of value on them. And so okay, so so in this case, what we were thinking about was, as we're picturing a minimum viable product, it's like, what are the basic features that we need to get this working for basic materials? We also felt that we need to look at what I call the minimum viable marketable product, which is basically the point at which it's advanced enough to handle some of those more complex materials and tasks, and we have enough content in there that it becomes something that we would want to market more widely. So it's not, just ready for production and then iterate. So basically ready for production and then iterated on until you get to this point where it's, this marketable product. And so we went through each of these features and identified whether we felt that it was something that it must have, it should have, it would be nice to have, we have no opinion, it was not discussed, or it already has it. The kinds of things that were not discussed are, there were some features in there that pertain to things that really didn't have anything to do with geo blacklight features, or features that are built into the system. They may have been workflow things, or things that were more theoretical in terms of the ways that a developer would work. And drawing a total blank on what some of those examples are, but so there were some things that were on this list that didn't end up really being features that we would want to consider as part of like the work to build this out. And so So some examples of what the MVP would be is that it does have, that we do have local UCSB and UCSD instances of Shoreline. So we each have our own instance, that we can ingest publicly accessible data in each of those. We can perform basic searches and interactions and get access to the metadata. And this is roughly equivalent to what Berkeley has right now. And so the idea, especially in this next work cycle, these first 4 sprints, is hopefully to get a product that is, to get it to it where it's an MVP. The MVMP, the Marketable product, would include things like interactive GIS maps, interactive GIS index maps, sorry, where you can use it to search within the index map, like I showed that one box that you can, if you can, go into a shapefile and click on these polygons, it's more interactive in that I can actually get one to select. Oh well, maybe a bit bigger. So not only does it just display this, but there are URLs in here that link to the actual maps at that location, if it's an index map for map sets, things like that. Other things is that the product can actually ingest scan maps, both georeferenced and non-georeferenced, and you have the mechanism to pan and zoom. The MVMP would include restricted data, and you have the access controls around that. And the MVMP pretty much includes all of the must-haves, the should-haves, and the nice-to-haves from the MVP, plus a few more. And we actually have a document that outlines what the minimum viable product is, and another one for the minimum viable marketable product. So if you can see, minimum viable product must-haves, I mean, it must ingest objects. It must deploy individual campus instances with local branding. Software updates do not lose local customizations. The object record page has a unique and permanent URL. You can download a layer in its original format. And if the object is part of a collection, a metadata field actually displays its collection name. And there's some sort of contact page or link. And then, of course, there's other must-haves and should-haves and nice-to-haves. And so, during this next work cycle, we'll work through these. And so pretty much, once you get through this list, you pretty much have the MVMP. So the idea between the MVP is, if we can get these must-haves done, that's enough to publish it, make it available, and then we can iterate on it after that. But at least there'll be something out there that we can start with.
And Tom, there's I think a salient question that just popped up in chat as well. John's asking whether there's a minimum set of supported file formats.
There is, and that is based on, well, let me put it this way. That was documented before the DCE work. So we haven't talked about it since then, but we have a set of sample data that was going to be tested in the system. And that included, point line and polygon vector files, grids, GeoJSON, GeoTIFFs, GeoTIFFs with Word files, DEMs. I think those are all our sample data. But go ahead.
There's a follow-up. Is that the set of 10 titles from 3 or 4 years ago? I think it might be more content than that, right?
I think it's a little more content than that, but it's roughly, I mean, a lot of it is Annabelle Ford's data that we're putting in there. And it basically that's the test data. And so jumping ahead just a little bit, once we get the MVP published and we start doing user testing and iterating on this, that's when it would be really good to ask what other formats do we need this to handle, and start getting those incorporated. Okay, so I just wanted to highlight some key takeaways from our work doing all this requirements gathering. The first is that all of the features that we've identified for the minimum viable product and all of the features we've identified for the minimum viable marketable product, must-haves and should-haves, are already being done by other institutions. So we have a long way that we could go before we get to stuff that has never been done before. So the only things right now, there are some things in the MBMP nice-to-haves that don't exist right now. And when we look at those, they're really not things that we think are really crucial at this point. So what I'm imagining is that if we can get up to this MBMP, at that point, we will be pretty much at the level of a Stanford or Harvard, or Stanford or Princeton or NYU as they are now. I mean, who knows where they're going to evolve over the next year or two, because it evolves quickly. But I'm hoping that once we get to that point, then we're actively part of the community and we're growing with the community. So as Geo Blacklight increases its abilities, we're incorporating that into ours as well. But I think the nice thing is with the minimum viable product that if we can get through all the must-haves, the should-haves, and the nice-to-haves, we are pretty close to where these other campuses are right now. Well, I'll let Tom talk about any sort of hiccups we might come up to. But just to quickly go over, where do we go from here? So we took these minimum viable product features and we converted them into GitLab tickets. And so we have a GitLab board, and we have all these tickets for each of these individual features. And so we'll be going through the process of breaking the tickets down into actually workable chunks and putting those into Sprint, determining what can be done and when. And so we'll be starting that planning tomorrow, actually. Well, we started a little bit yesterday, but we'll be continuing it tomorrow in the Shoreline Sprint planning. And then, then we have the 2-month work cycle where we're seeing how far we can get with this. When we get to the MVP, at that point, then it's time for us to start adding content. So we can start adding our local content and doing outreach, showing it to people, trying to figure out who our users are that we can talk to and get some feedback from, and continue to iterate towards what I call the MBMP. And I think that once we get to the MVP, we'll also, because we'll be at the same level as Berkeley, I think that'd be a really good time to bring them into the conversation. I mean, we've already had some preliminary talks with Susan there, and Susan Powell, which would be like John and Amy, my equivalent there. And so there is interest in bringing them on board, but it would make sense, I think, after we get the MVP done, that at least that would be a chance for Berkeley to come in and we would all be at the same level and go from there. And then work with the Geo Blacklight community as they're developing things.
Tom, can I ask a question?
Sure.
You said that all of the really desirable features were already being done by other institutions. So does that mean that those features are already in GeoBlacklight, or there's still work that we have to do here? Like, just to pull out one thing, it's a little hard to read, but ingest a DEM into Shoreline. So presumably other folks already have DEMs in their GeoBlacklight instances, but is there a task here that we have to do to make that happen for our instance?
Well, that particular ticket, see, one thing is because we can't ingest, well, you have a two-part answer because I think there's two parts to that. So one is because we were unable to ingest our own data into our Shoreline GeoBlacklight, there are a lot of features that didn't work. So I have a feeling that once we're able to ingest data in, we'll be able to tell if those features work, and they will probably just work because they're native in GeoBlacklight, but we haven't been able to test that yet. So I think a lot of those are going to be really easy to tick off, that they're done.
Well, those are the best kind of tickets.
Yeah, exactly. And so ingest a DEM into Shoreline is one of those tickets. It's like, this is just part of that, ingesting our data. So yes, there are some of those. Well, I think the features that are in, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, but the features that are in the main GeoBlacklight code, we have. And so we're already really evaluating with that. So all those things that have been done by other institutions, they're doing that locally. And I don't know how that system works in terms of how they contribute that back to the community, but it's something that maybe only Princeton does or only Stanford does. And so I don't know, if it's just, do we borrow that code? I don't know how that works, because the other aspect of this is because these instances, or one of the reasons these instances are so different amongst these institutions is because everybody's stack looks different. And so they have different ingest processes, they have different, and so they're building something for their stack that maybe doesn't directly translate to somebody else's stack. So maybe that's why it's not in the main GeoBlacklight. Or, well, I also have to remember, GeoBlacklight is just the interface. There's this whole thing underneath GeoBlacklight.
So Tom Brittnacher, or anybody on the team, at what point after this 2-month work cycle goes past, the earlier steps here at UCSB of formalizing, what our digital library consists of, there's policy and practice questions that will need to be answered down the road, like what will we put in here? What's our collection development policy? Is it appropriate for us to solicit directly from faculty? Is this for commercial data? Is there a mandate for you as the product owner to present recommendations to admin, or do you have the authority? Like where does the authority lie to say this is what we're going to put in here?
Those are conversations that we need to have, and those are conversations we should start having. I have a list of those types of questions and getting answers to exactly what you're asking.
Okay. So that's not necessarily dependent on this work in this cycle.
No, that has nothing to do. No, because.
So when do you foresee initiating those conversations? And I'm curious about down at San Diego, what's that process going to look like there? Or are you just haven't even considered that yet?
Well, no, I think it's just time. We've had so many other things we needed to do first. So yeah, it's not like I'm waiting for anything to happen for those conversations to start. It's just that we've had so many other things we've had to do first. But I think, once we have an MVP, that's when those questions, we really need to start thinking about those.
And that's what That's what I was thinking on our side, is that it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense unless there was something to point to of we want to build it more like this. Please let us proceed. So I think that's great for us. How about San Diego? Like what's like?
So I mean, we've started to have some of those conversations. I would say in the last 2 weeks. Abby from our metadata team is on here, but we realize that there are larger questions that we need to have that involve others from the higher ups, and so it's a matter of that's architecturally speaking, and how does that work with our whole existing infrastructure. And so I think there's conversations that need to happen collectively, sort of around a number of different topics, but also then with our own digital library components at our own institutions. But I think those are things that we know we need to do. And so I think as part of this sprint cycle, I think there's the development sprint cycle. And then I think there's also sort of these larger conversations that we really need to talk about as well, so that are related to the project, but not dependent on development, if that makes sense.
Okay, great, thanks. Tom, did you have a clarification on what I was saying earlier? I'm not sure if what I was saying was totally accurate.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I wasn't sure whether y'all could hear me. Yeah, so what you were saying is accurate, and so the version of Geo Blacklight that we are working against was up to date as recently as the late fall, so sometime in November, I think. So the features that are in the shared code base are accessible to us on the condition, of course, that we actually get content loaded into it correctly. And then the normal practice, for better or worse, is that a lot of folks do local custom development, and that the process, and we know this from our Hyrax involvement as well, that the process for bringing those customizations back into shared code is a little bit like pulling teeth. And one of the main reasons for that is that those local customizations that people work on their own applications are sometimes things that the developers just aren't proud of, right? They feel like they're hacky or blah, blah, right? Like various reasons why people either don't take the time or feel too self-conscious to try and make a community contribution. The upside of all of that is that if we have this handy spreadsheet of who's deploying what, and all of those folks are releasing their code under Apache, which is common practice. And I would say that I would be shocked to learn that very many of those spreadsheet deployers are not doing that. Then it should be easy enough for us to go find that feature and at least evaluate its implementation, so that those contributions will necessarily be free. They won't be, but it is a big boost that we've sort of done this legwork already, and that we do have this open source community sitting next to us. And maybe some of the outcomes are that we do the legwork to get that stuff back into the community code base, and maybe some of the time we just rip somebody's stuff and polish it a little bit for our own use.
Okay, thanks. So Tom, is there anything else you wanted to add about like the roadblocks that we've had and what's coming up, like what developers should expect in this upcoming work cycle?
Yeah, I mean, Alex and I were talking about this yesterday. I think that the anticipate a huge number of roadblocks, but the big critical success points for the for the MVP are going to be the two applications deployed as early as possible and getting the data in as early as possible. I think that the risks are that we struggle to deploy, and that once we have data in, that we realize that there's there's more work to do than we thought. So getting those two tasks taken care of early seems like a big win. Our strategy for loading content is to build a developer supported workflow to start, and trust that infrastructure, the infrastructural code that powers that workflow won't be wasted when it comes time to do something that's more staff facing, for lack of a better word. I feel like we're staff too, but you know, that's more librarian facing, maybe is also not a quite precise way of saying it. And then so our goal is to get content in as soon as possible, and then rather than spend a lot of time on a really polished ingest workflow and then realize that now that we've got the content in, it's not quite what we wanted or quite what we expected. So that's the rough shape of it. The other point where there's a little bit of like an open technical question is how we're going to do custom theming. So we tackled this problem a little bit on Spotlight, but Spotlight ships with a theming system that we were able to kind of bend to our needs. And that's not the case with Geo Blacklight. So we'll have to come up with a way to make the deployment of UCSB and UCSB and UCSD separate themes workable. I think that doesn't quite as much come to the level of a critical success, like early success metric, because I think that we will figure something out one way or another. But it is sort of unanticipated. We don't actually know how we'll tackle this from a technical standpoint yet. Case. Those are the big early technical hurdles to my mind, and I'm happy to hear from any of the other technically minded folks on the call about any concerns that they have, or Alex, if you have thoughts.
I mean, I have thoughts about how we'll go about that. I'm not sure if that would be getting too much into the weeds for this kickoff meeting, but yeah, those were the kind of what I saw as two priorities, both at least getting basic branding set up, so it's not just, doesn't look like just a completely stock website. But yeah, the problem with working with these open source projects is that not only do you have to like kind of working with the community to get stuff upstream can be a slow process. In the case of Blacklight in particular, things exist at kind of different levels. So that Blacklight is a piece of software. Geo Blacklight is built on top of it. Spotlight is also built on top of Blacklight, and Spotlight that has all the theming. But we don't want to just have to copy all the same code over to Geo Blacklight. So maybe like the ideal solution would be to kind of figure out how to get it into the shared Blacklight code base, but that could be a very long process, working with many institutions to make sure we don't break their Blacklight instances. So we might, in the short term, end up with kind of a bit of a hacky fix just to get things working for us before we do it right. That's just something I was thinking. right now, because I did a lot of the work on our version of Spotlight, which we, on top of Spotlight, we built further modifications so that we could have UCSD and UCSB maintain separate themes for their separate deployed instances. So it's a little messy, and working with a number of other institutions that are all sharing the same community code does slow things down. But the idea anyway is that in the long run, it's better for everyone. So we'll see. Hopefully we won't test your patience too much.
All right, thanks.
Tom, do you have a sense of when your minimum marketable product will be ready?
That all depends, and actually that leads into, I'm just going to talk about some practical information. So we're entering a 2-month work cycle starting Wednesday, February 5th, and it runs to Tuesday, March 31st. That's four sprints. Surfliner is trying to go to a 2-month on, 2-month off, 2-month on, 2-month off cycle, so that in those off months, campuses can work on local things. So the idea is hopefully we can put more resources on Surfliner by putting those within the 2 months and then letting the campuses work on their things during the next 2 months. Shoreline was identified as the top priority of both campuses for this work cycle, and that pretty much, other than maybe a few other things on some of the other products, almost all the time will be devoted to Shoreline. Given that, I am planning for the possibility that the next work cycle, which would be, like June, July, we may not get any time for Shoreline because there are other things that need to be developed. And so we may not get a sprint, for a long time. But the nice thing about having an MVP, if we can get an MVP done, we may be able to get a lot done with just one sprint. If it's just, a few things here and there. So, we may have a chance to do a little bit during the next work cycle. But so it really depends on what the demands are for the other Surfliner products as to how much developer time we can get for getting from the MVP to the MVP. So I have absolutely no idea what that's going to look like. That's one reason why I would ideally like to bring Berkeley on board once we have the MVP, because then if we're all at the same level, that's maybe one more developer we have access to. Yeah, so beyond that, I really can't speculate when that's going to be. Does that answer your question?
Well, yeah, I guess that does.
Yeah, and from the technical side, I'm also going to be super fearful of offering real estimates, but I will express a lot of confidence that the MVP as scoped is in a space where we really should be able to deliver it in the time that we've got here. And then I'd be optimistic about checking off some of the things that fall into the MVMP space. I think it's worth acknowledging that some of the MVMP requirements are related to actually loading large-scale content into the thing, right? Like actually getting content in, not just having software features. So then I'd anticipate something of a process between the MVP and the let's roll this thing out as a big marketable product. But that's a gap that I think, Tom, I think you're right to point to the question of how much work cycle time will we be able to do in the next Surfliner group of sprints. Like, will we be able to get a Shoreline sprint then? And if the answer is yes, then I think that would go a long way towards moving this forward on a faster timeline.
Okay, so the last practical point I wanted to mention was meeting cadence. So the GitLab README has been updated, and it's in the notes, and I don't have access to my chat at the moment. I don't think it's coming up if I put my no. So, but it is in the notes. So previously, we sent out some group invites for various meetings, but we're not going to be doing that this time around. Everybody's kind of responsible for putting these things on their own calendars. And so that's why we have this wiki here to identify the daily stand-ups are going to be all projects, and the sprint retrospective is for all projects. And then Shoreline has its own, like we have the current kickoff meeting right now. We had the backlog refinement meeting yesterday or Monday. We had we're having the Shoreline sprint planning meeting tomorrow. Oh, I'm sorry. The backlog refinement is every other Wednesday, 1 to 2, and the Zoom link is here. Sprint planning is going to be every other Thursday, 3 to 4, and the Zoom link is here. And then the sprint review is every other Tuesday, 1:30 to 2:30, and the Zoom link is here. So they all have different Zoom links, different cadences, and so just if folks could be mindful of, those of you that are working on the product and are interested or are required or optional to attend those, if you could please make sure you're putting those on your calendar, so we can have you there. So that's all I had. So we've got, say, about 5 or 10 more minutes if folks want to ask other questions. Does anybody else have any other questions? Okay, well, not hearing any. I want to thank everybody for attending, and I'm really looking forward to this work cycle. I'm very optimistic that we'll be able to see some results, some good results. So I'm looking forward to it. If anybody does have any questions or comments later on, feel free to contact me. And one of the things that I'm learning as PO that I need to figure out are all the communication channels and how I should be sharing all this information out. So, all of you on the call that are stakeholders and not necessarily actively working in the sprint, I will hopefully figure out ways of getting information out to you about what's going on and how we do this. I think the sprint review, I think, is where we demo what's been done over the last sprint. I believe we record those, and so those should be available as well.
That's correct.
Okay, great. Yeah, so that's also a good way to see what's been done. So yes, so I'll work on getting all that information out to all of you. So thank you very much. I appreciate you all attending, and I will talk to you all soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
everyone.